What happens when an entire circle of friends watches someone's life fall apart and says nothing? This is the true story of how silence can be the cruelest betrayal of all. The first time I met Jake and Michelle was at a backyard barbecue in the summer of 2011. They were the kind of couple that made you believe in love again. The kind that finished each other's sentences, shared inside jokes that made everyone around them smile, and had that effortless chemistry that can't be faked. Jake had been my roommate's friend from college, one of those genuinely good guys who would give you the shirt off his back without thinking twice. He was an engineer, methodical and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught you off guard. Michelle was his opposite in the best way, spontaneous, vivacious, and always the life of the party. She had this infectious laugh that could fill a room. They'd met during their senior year at a state university in the Midwest. The story of how they got together had become legendary among our friend group. Michelle had literally crashed into Jake at a coffee shop, spilling her latte all over his laptop. Instead of getting angry, Jake had laughed it off and asked her if she wanted to get another coffee, his treat, since technically she'd already bought him one, even if it ended up on his keyboard rather than in a cup. 6 months later, they were inseparable. 2 years after graduation, Jake proposed on the beach in Santa Monica during sunset, with a ring he'd saved up for over a year to buy. Michelle said yes before he could even finish the question. Their wedding in 2013 was everything you'd expect, beautiful, heartfelt, and full of joy. I was there, watching Jake's eyes well up as Michelle walked down the aisle in a simple white dress that somehow made her look like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. When they said their vows, you could feel the sincerity radiating from both of them. "I promise to love you through every season," Jake had said, his voice cracking slightly. "To be your partner in every adventure, your comfort in every storm, and your biggest cheerleader in every dream you chase." Michelle had wiped away tears as she recited her own vows. "I promise to choose you every single day," she'd said, looking deep into his eyes. "To build a life with you that's full of laughter, love, and endless possibilities. You're my best friend, my soulmate, and my home." Everyone clapped. Everyone cheered. Everyone believed every word. I wish I could say that's how the story ended, with that perfect moment frozen in time like a photograph. But life has a way of taking your prettiest pictures and setting them on fire. About 6 months after their wedding, I accepted a job offer in Seattle that was too good to pass up. Jake and Michelle were living in Minneapolis, where they'd both grown up and where most of our friend group still resided. The move was bittersweet. I was excited about the opportunity, but leaving behind the community I'd built felt like tearing out a piece of myself. "Don't be a stranger," Jake had said when we grabbed beers the night before I left. "You better come visit, man. And we'll come out to Seattle too. Michelle's been dying to see the Pacific Northwest." "Deal," I'd said, clinking my glass against his. "And you know you've always got a place to crash." For the first year or so, we kept in touch regularly. Phone calls every few weeks, text messages about random things, sports scores, funny memes, updates about mutual friends. Jake and Michelle did make it out to Seattle that first summer, and we spent a long weekend exploring Pike Place Market, hiking in the Cascades, and eating our way through the city's food scene. Everything seemed fine, normal, happy even. But over time, as it often does with distance, our communication became less frequent. Life got busy. Weeks would pass between conversations. The months. We'd still see each other when I flew back for Christmas or major events, maybe once or twice more throughout the year, but the deep, regular connection we'd once had started to fade. I didn't notice the changes at first. When you only see someone a few times a year, it's hard to track the subtle shifts in their demeanor, the small cracks forming in the foundation of their life. It's like watching a plant grow. If you check on it every day, you barely notice the change. But if you look away for months and then look back, suddenly it's either thriving or withering, and you missed all the moments in between. Looking back now, I can see the signs that were there during those visits. Michelle was always distracted, constantly checking her phone. She'd disappear for long stretches during group gatherings, claiming she needed to take work calls or step outside for fresh air. She'd gotten a job in pharmaceutical sales, which meant a lot of travel, or so she said. Jake would make jokes about being a bachelor 3 nights a week while she was gone, but there was something hollow in his laugh when he said it. The Michelle I'd known in college had been flirtatious, sure, but in that harmless way that some naturally charismatic people are. She lit up around people, loved being the center of attention, thrived in social situations. I'd chalked up her behavior to just being her personality. She was friendly, outgoing, maybe a little too comfortable with physical touch, a hand on someone's arm during conversation, sitting a little too close during group dinners, but nothing that seemed overtly inappropriate. At least, that's what I told myself. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March 2017 when my phone rang with Jake's name on the screen. We hadn't talked in probably 2 months, so seeing his call in the middle of a workday immediately made me pause. "Hey man, what's up?" I answered, stepping away from my desk. The voice that came through the phone barely sounded like Jake. It was hollow, broken, like someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that made him who he was. "She asked for a divorce." 3 words. That's all it took for my entire understanding of their relationship to shatter. "What? Jake, what happened?" "I don't know, man. I don't know." His voice cracked and I could hear him fighting back tears. She sat me down last night and said she wasn't happy. That she hasn't been happy for a long time. That she needs to find herself or some bullshit like that. She's moving out this weekend. My mind reeled. Did she say why? Did something happen? That's the thing. I keep going over it in my head, and I can't figure out what I did wrong. Was I not attentive enough? Did I work too much? Not enough? Did I stop being romantic? I mean, we've had our rough patches like any couple, but I thought we were good. I thought we were solid. For the next hour, I listened as Jake poured out his confusion and pain. He dissected every moment of their marriage, questioning every decision he'd made, wondering where he'd failed. It was gutting to hear someone I cared about so completely blame themselves for something that, even from thousands of miles away with limited information, I suspected wasn't their fault at all. "Maybe this is just temporary," he said at one point, grasping for hope. "Maybe she needs space to work through whatever she's going through, and then we can figure it out." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. Something in my gut told me there was more to this story, pieces Jake either didn't know or wasn't ready to share. Over the following weeks, I checked in with Jake regularly. His mental state deteriorated rapidly. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, was barely functioning at work. He'd moved into a friend's spare bedroom because he couldn't stand being in the apartment he'd shared with Michelle, surrounded by the ghost of their life together. "She took the coffee maker," he told me during one call, and then laughed, this awful, broken sound. "Isn't that stupid? Of all the things to care about, I'm upset about a coffee maker. She took the one we got as a wedding present from your cousin. I make coffee every morning now in this shitty drip machine, and I think about how we used to fight over who got the first cup. She always won because I'm too much of a pushover. And now I'd give anything to lose that argument again." I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who's watching their entire life unravel? It was mid-May when I flew back to Minneapolis for a long weekend. I hadn't planned the trip around seeing Jake, but once I knew I'd be in town, I reached out. We met at a dive bar we used to frequent in college, dark wood, sticky floors, and the best buffalo wings in the city. Jake looked terrible. He'd lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and seemed to have aged 5 years in 2 months. But he was trying to move forward, trying to heal, trying to rebuild some version of himself that could exist without Michelle. "I signed the papers last week," he told me, nursing a beer. "She wanted it fast. Uncontested. She didn't even want anything, said she just wanted out. How do you process that? Your wife of 4 years just wants out, like you're a bad job or an apartment with a broken lease." We talked for hours, circling around the same questions he'd been asking himself for months. What went wrong? What could he have done differently? Would he ever feel normal again? I wanted to tell him it would get better. I wanted to believe that was enough. But then something he said made my blood run cold. The weirdest part? She seemed relieved. Happy almost. Like this weight had been lifted. She mentioned she was taking a trip to Mexico next month with some friends. Celebrating her freedom or something. I didn't even know she was planning a trip. Mexico. The word triggered something in my memory. About 3 weeks earlier, I'd been scrolling through Instagram and seen a post from a mutual acquaintance, Sarah, who'd been in Michelle's sorority. It was a typical beach photo, margaritas and sunsets, but Michelle had been tagged in it. I'd thought it was weird at the time because Jake had never mentioned Michelle taking a trip, and this was right around when they were supposedly dealing with divorce paperwork. I'd scrolled through Michelle's profile out of curiosity. She'd made it private since the split, but I was still following her from the old days. There were recent photos from what looked like a resort in Mexico. Group shots with people I didn't recognize. And in several of them, there was a guy, tall, tan, probably in his late 30s, with that kind of artificial charm you can spot a mile away. In multiple photos, he had his arm around Michelle. At the time, I'd assumed it was innocent. Friend group on vacation. Nothing unusual. But sitting there with Jake, watching him torture himself over what he'd done wrong, something clicked into place. The constant travel. The emotional distance. The sudden need for freedom. The relief in her voice when she talked about the divorce. The next morning, I did something I'd been debating since our conversation. I reached out to Sarah. We'd never been close, but we'd hung out enough in the same circles that a friendly message wouldn't seem strange. I kept it casual. Hey, saw you were in Mexico. Looks amazing. How have you been? And eventually steered the conversation toward Michelle. Sarah's response came an hour later, and it confirmed my suspicions. Oh God, yeah, Michelle was there. Did Jake not tell you? She's been seeing this guy Carlos for like 6 months. He's married too, which is such a mess, but she's convinced he's going to leave his wife for her. It's honestly sad. She seems obsessed. My hands were shaking as I read the message. 6 months. She'd been cheating on Jake for at least 6 months before asking for a divorce. Maybe longer. I called an old friend from college, Marcus, who still lived in Minneapolis and ran in the same social circles as Jake and Michelle. I needed to know if what Sarah said was true or if it was just gossip. Man, where do I even start? Marcus said with a heavy sigh. Yeah, Michelle's been cheating on Jake for a while. More than just the Mexico guy. I mean, I don't have like a detailed timeline or whatever, but people have known for at least a year, maybe longer. She was always hooking up with guys when she traveled for work. There were rumors about a coworker. Then this Carlos dude from Mexico happened, and I guess that's when she decided to end it with Jake. Why didn't anyone tell him? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Silence on the other end. Marcus. Why didn't anyone tell him? I don't know, man. It wasn't my business? I don't know, like it would cause more problems than it would solve? What if we were wrong? What if it was just rumors? But you weren't wrong. No, we weren't wrong. I hung up feeling sick. Not just because Michelle had betrayed Jake so thoroughly, but because an entire community of people who claimed to care about him had watched it happen and said nothing. I flew back to Seattle the next day, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd learned. For 3 days, I wrestled with whether to tell Jake. What purpose would it serve? Would it help him heal, or would it just add another layer of pain to an already devastating situation? But then I thought about how he'd been blaming himself. How he was torturing himself trying to figure out what he'd done wrong, how he'd failed, how he could have saved their marriage. He deserved to know the truth. He deserved to know that this wasn't his failure. I called him on a Thursday evening. Jake, I need to talk to you about something, and it's going to be hard to hear. Okay. His voice was cautious, uncertain. Michelle was cheating on you. For a while. At least 6 months before she asked for the divorce, but probably longer. Silence. Jake. How do you know? His voice was barely above a whisper. I told him everything. The photos from Mexico. Sarah's confirmation. Marcus's admission that their friend group had known for over a year. The married guy she was waiting for. More silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The self-doubt was gone, replaced by something else. Anger, yes, but also a kind of clarity. Everyone knew? Not everyone. But some people. More than should have. And no one told me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact that he was trying to process. My friends watched my wife cheat on me and didn't say anything. I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry. I was across the country or I would have. I believe you. He took a shaky breath. Thank you for telling me. I've been driving myself crazy thinking I destroyed my own marriage, and this whole time. This wasn't your fault, Jake. None of this was your fault. That conversation changed something in him. When we talked over the following weeks, he sounded different. Still hurt, still processing, but no longer drowning in self-blame. The truth, as painful as it was, had given him something to stand on, solid ground after months of quicksand. A guide for the uncomfortable conversation. Since all of this happened, I've unfortunately had to have versions of this conversation with other friends in different situations. It never gets easier, but I've learned a few things about how to approach it. 1. Be certain of your information. Don't drop a bomb like this based on rumors or speculation. If you're going to tell someone their partner is cheating, you need to be confident in your sources. 2. Do it privately. Not at a party. Not in a group setting. Not via text. This deserves a face-to-face conversation, or at minimum a phone call if distance makes in-person impossible. 3. Be direct but compassionate. Don't dance around it. Don't hedge. But also recognize that you're delivering information that will fundamentally alter their world. I have something difficult to tell you, and I'm sorry this is going to hurt, is a reasonable way to start. Provide specifics. Don't just say, I heard they're cheating. Give them concrete information, what you know, how you know it, when it happened. This helps them understand the scope and decide what to do next. 5. Prepare for multiple reactions. They might believe you immediately. They might get angry at you. They might deny it. They might break down. All of these are valid responses to devastating information. Don't take their initial reaction personally. 6. Offer support but respect boundaries. Let them know you're there for them, but don't push. Some people need space to process. Some people need to talk through everything immediately. Follow their lead. 7. Don't expect gratitude. At least not right away. Shooting the messenger is a real thing, and even if intellectually they know you did the right thing, emotionally they might need time to separate you from the pain of the information you delivered. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the other major character in this mess. Carlos, the married guy from Mexico that Michelle became obsessed with. From what I pieced together through various sources, Carlos was exactly the kind of guy you'd expect in this scenario. Mid to late 30s, successful in some vague business sense, charming in that practiced way that serial cheaters develop. He'd been married for over a decade and had 2 kids. He and Michelle met at a resort in Cabo during one of her work trips. According to the story that filtered back through mutual connections, they'd hit it off at the hotel bar, spent the weekend together, and continued the affair remotely once they returned to their respective lives. Here's the thing about affairs with married people. They almost never end the way the other person hopes. The math is simple. If someone is willing to cheat on their spouse with you, they're showing you exactly who they are. And if they do eventually leave their spouse for you, congratulations, you've won the prize of being with someone you already know is a cheater. But Michelle bought into the fantasy anyway. According to people who stayed in touch with her, she genuinely believed Carlos was going to leave his wife. He'd apparently told her all the classic lines, "I'm only staying for the kids. My wife and I are basically roommates. I've never felt this way about anyone before. I just need to wait for the right time." The right time never comes for guys like Carlos. Because guys like Carlos are comfortable. They've figured out how to have their cake and eat it too. They get the stability and social respectability of marriage, plus the excitement and validation of an affair. Why would they blow that up? Last anyone heard, several years later, Carlos is still married to his wife. Still living in Mexico. Probably still having affairs, just not with Michelle anymore. And Michelle? Still single. Still holding on to hope that somehow, someday, Carlos will realize his mistake and come back to her. It would be sad if it weren't so predictable. One thing that doesn't get talked about enough in these situations is how far the damage spreads. It's not just Jake who was hurt. It's not even just Jake and Michelle. Jake's family was devastated. His parents had welcomed Michelle as a daughter. His sister had been her bridesmaid. Family holidays had been planned around coordinating schedules with Michelle's family. All of that ended in an instant, leaving a hole where there used to be a person they loved. Michelle's family was caught in the middle. Her parents apparently tried to talk her out of the divorce, sensing that she was making a massive mistake. Her younger sister stopped speaking to her for almost a year over it. The friend group fractured. Some people stayed loyal to Jake. Some people stayed friendly with both of them, trying to remain neutral. A few sided with Michelle, either because they didn't know the full story or because they'd been complicit in hiding her affairs and couldn't admit they'd been wrong. People who had nothing to do with the core situation got dragged in. The wife of Carlos, who presumably had no idea her husband was having an affair. The co-workers Michelle had hooked up with, some of whom were also married or in relationships. The web of damage extended far beyond the central couple. And then there's the psychological toll on Jake that extended well beyond the immediate pain of the divorce. He developed trust issues that affected his subsequent relationships. He second-guessed his own judgment. He struggled with the question of whether he'd ever really known Michelle at all, and if he'd been that wrong about her, what else might he be wrong about? It took him years to work through all of that. Years of therapy. Years of patient support from people who actually cared about him. Years of slowly rebuilding his sense of self and his ability to trust. All because one person decided that their temporary pleasure was worth more than their promises. And because a dozen other people decided that their comfort was worth more than their friends' well-being. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what loyalty actually means, especially in the context of friendships and relationships. Because the people who didn't tell Jake would probably say they were being loyal to the friend group, to peace, to the idea that you don't get involved in other people's relationships. But that's not loyalty. That's cowardice hiding behind etiquette. Real loyalty is uncomfortable. Real loyalty sometimes means having hard conversations that might damage your relationships. Real loyalty means prioritizing your friend's actual well-being over your own comfort or social convenience. Here's a test I've started using. If you knew that your friend would want to know something, even if finding out would hurt them, then you have an obligation to tell them. Because the alternative is making a choice for them, deciding that you know better than they do about what they should and shouldn't know about their own life. That's not friendship. That's paternalism at best and betrayal at worst. I also think there's a gendered component to this that's worth examining. In many social circles, there's this unspoken code among men that you don't interfere in another guy's relationship. You mind your business. You let people work out their own problems. Telling your buddy that his wife is cheating is seen as crossing a line, being a drama starter, or worst of all, being unable to respect the sanctity of marriage. But that code serves exactly one purpose: protecting cheaters and enabling betrayal. Because here's the thing, the sanctity of marriage was already violated by the person who was cheating. You're not interfering in a healthy relationship, you're providing information about a relationship that's already broken. The real question is, who's more important to you, your friend or your comfort? Signs I missed, and you shouldn't. Looking back with the clarity that only hindsight provides, there were so many red flags that should have been obvious. If this story helps even one person recognize these patterns in their own life or in the life of someone they care about, then maybe something good can come from all this mess. 1. The phone obsession. Michelle was always on her phone. Not just casually checking it, but that frantic, possessive way where the phone might as well have been surgically attached to her hand. She'd tilt the screen away when notifications came in. She'd step out of rooms to take calls. She'd panic if she couldn't find it. If your partner's phone habits have changed dramatically, password changes, screen tilting, taking the phone everywhere including the bathroom, that's a sign worth noting. 2. Increased work travel. Michelle's job supposedly required a lot more travel after she and Jake got married. Funny how that works. While some jobs genuinely do require travel, a sudden dramatic increase, especially if the trips are vague or the details don't quite add up, is suspicious. 3. Emotional distance. This one's harder to quantify, but it was visible in their interactions. They went from finishing each other's sentences to barely talking. From constant physical affection to sitting on opposite ends of the couch. From inside jokes to awkward silence. Relationships naturally evolve and the crazy honeymoon period doesn't last forever, But there's a difference between comfortable familiarity and cold distance. For separate social lives, Michelle started going out more without Jake. Girls' nights that happened multiple times a week. Trips with friends where Jake wasn't invited. A whole social ecosystem that Jake wasn't part of and didn't really know anything about. Again, having separate interests and friend groups is healthy. Having entire sections of your life that your spouse knows nothing about is not. 5. Defensiveness. When Jake would ask innocent questions about Michelle's day or her trips, she'd get defensive. Turn it around on him. Accuse him of being controlling or not trusting her. If asking normal questions about your partner's life is met with hostility or accusations, something's wrong. Either they're hiding something, or there are serious communication issues. Either way, it's a problem. 6. The friend group's weird behavior. This one Jake didn't notice, but I did after I found out the truth. Certain friends would get uncomfortable when Michelle was brought up in conversation. They'd change the subject quickly. There was this weird tension around the whole topic of their marriage. When multiple people in a social circle are acting strange about someone's relationship, pay attention. They probably know something. The beautiful thing about Jake's story, the redemptive part, if there is one, is how he managed to rebuild himself after everything fell apart. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. But it was real. He started by cutting out the people who'd betrayed him through their silence. That meant losing several friendships he'd thought would last a lifetime, but he came to see it as pruning dead branches. These weren't real friends anyway. Real friends don't watch you suffer when they could prevent it. He invested heavily in therapy, which he'd been skeptical about at first. "I'm not crazy," he'd said when his sister first suggested it. But he went anyway, and it changed his life. He learned that you don't go to therapy because you're crazy. You go because you're human, and sometimes being human is really fucking hard. Through therapy, he worked on understanding how he'd missed the signs, not because he wanted to blame himself, but because he wanted to make sure he'd recognize them in the future. He learned about his patterns, how he'd always been someone who wanted to see the best in people, sometimes to the point of ignoring obvious red flags.